Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our very first webinar of the year, 2021. We've made it. Thank you for taking the time to do this, Kim and James, and thank you to our audience for taking the time out of your day to watch. This webinar will be available on demand via our website. And if you're watching right now, please feel free to reach out with any questions or let us know if you like this format over live webcasts. We appreciate any and all feedback. This webcast is titled The Pharmaceutical Company Lifecycle, and today we will start out with some introductions and then get right into it, discussing the challenges faced by biotech and pharma companies. Starting with preclinical and phase 1 companies, we'll then move on to phase 2, and we will wrap up by briefly discussing phase 3 and commercialization. As today's webinar will primarily focus on the beginning of the life cycle, without further ado, we welcome in our guests for our moderated panel discussion. The Director of Controllership Advisory Services at Genova Group, Kim Smith, and the Managing Director and Chief Solutions Architect, James Neal of AdaptaLogix. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
So to get started, we'll go to Kim first. Can you give a brief description of yourself and your background and the company?
Absolutely. My name is Kim Smith. I am with the Genova Group. Genova Group is a boutique financial consulting firm. We provide expertise in financial reporting, technical accounting, IPO readiness, valuations, taxes, and now I'm happy to add controller services to those offerings. I began my career in audit with the Big Four and moved to industry, with the last 10 years focused primarily on life sciences. I have held various financial roles, most recently as the VP of Finance and Corporate Controller for Team Unity Therapeutics.
Excellent. And James?
Yeah, so I'm James Neal. I've been in the ERP world, so accounting systems, enterprise resource planning systems for over 25 years at this point. Worked earlier in my career in multiple different industries. Job shop manufacturing and professional services. Eventually got into pharmaceuticals, so working with CROs, CMOs, pharmaceuticals. I actually worked for a company called Biopharma. Worked for the company as an employee, and until that company was bought by Shire. Worked with Shire a bit, and then left, and started AdaptaLogix. And with AdaptaLogix, we started with the idea of what I had learned from those years of working within the pharmas, with the systems that we would make work within these various companies. Started AdaptaLogix with the idea that we would deliver ERP, deliver solutions around accounting and ERP just for the pharmaceutical and biotech world. So our customer base, since I started the company and still continues to stay, is 100% pharmaceutical and biotech.
Excellent. Welcome. So starting off with preclinical and phase 1 companies, and our first question goes to Kim. So in your experiences, how do small pharma startups often start out, and who is a part of that initial team?
The typical startup begins with some founders, perhaps a couple scientists who have developed or purchased some intellectual property. Then they have to figure out, what do they want to do with that IP? Do they have funding already on hand that they can go right into preclinical and clinical work? Or do they need to suss out a management team and work with their investors to develop their board as well? One of the things that I have seen, and I've been lucky to be an early employee at a couple startups locally, is that a lot of the focus is on those big picture items. But something that should start from the beginning in order for a business to be successful is the back office operations, things like finance and accounting, because everything the company will do and does is affecting your financials. And it's really critical to have that information up front and available to report to interested parties.
So Kim, what kind of funding type is typical for a company to get started with?
So it's fairly typical to start with what's called a Series seed. And that is just your first round of funding. It could just be the founders. Maybe you have one primary investor who's given a few $1 million to get things rolling. and it'll grow from there. If you're a private company, you'll do, a round of financing. They'll start with the letter A, and it's nothing fancy to it. It's just alphabetical from A to Z, to, depending on the needs of the company. And one of the ways you justify the need for that funding, right, is having spending reports, having budget reports, being able to share with those potential investors what your use of funds is going to be, and so that they can see a return on their investment. It's critical, again, to have that information ready and available when you want to go to the markets, when you want to do some fundraising, if you're going to talk to banks or investors or even auditors. That information needs to be ready to go as early as possible to make your life easier and the business more successful.
Great. So after securing the funding, where does the first check go? And who is often the first person hired to build out your team as a pharma company?
Well, I would say even before that first check, have a budget. Even if it's just in Excel, you can put a nice little budget together that says, here's the money I'm asking for, here's how I'm going to use it. And that way, when you start spending money, you have your hands around where it's going and why. That it doesn't just become a frenzy of, I've got $5 million in Series Seed, let me just start cutting checks. But typically, I would think that first check is going to go to lawyers as the organization becomes a legal entity and you go through the registration process in whatever state you choose, or whatever country you choose. There's a lot of administrative stuff that goes with that. So I would think the lawyers would be the first. And then next would be, again, employees. Hiring those employees, working with an HR firm or a recruiter to develop your management team and get to start paying them.
Yeah, and I can tell you, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Kim, but I've seen, a lot of our companies that, we get, which are of course in later phases, they've incorporated in some pretty weird places to try to take a tax advantage even before they had an idea of what their, supply chain looked like and whether they would actually get any benefits out of that incorporation.
Yeah, I think it's important to sit back and really strategize and think about the big picture, where the business is going to go, how are you going to get there? And one of those things, if you have visibility to your potential supply chain and the markets that you intend to commercialize into, is to only set up those registrations, those legal entities in the jurisdictions that really require them. Ireland, for example, was one a few years back where everyone was moving to incorporate in the Irish jurisdiction because there was going to be a potential tax shelter there. And then obviously the US government changed its approach to taxation in result. But you do want to think about things like intercompany profit. You don't want to overcomplicate things. One of the things that we would say at my previous employer was always fit for purpose. Is this fit for purpose? And it might be something you aspire to, but it may not be something you have to do right now.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many we've seen where they've said, oh, and we've got this other dormant entity over here.
And they're just headaches. They, honestly, it becomes a just cleanup process 3 or 4 years down the road, and nobody remembers why those entities were ever opened in the first place.
Yep.
Great. So this one goes to Kim and James. What are the biggest challenges that arise during the preclinical period for a company?
Yeah, to follow on to what I said in your last question, Nick, if the biggest challenge, I think, is that big picture. When you're first getting funding, a lot of founders and executives are focused on their elevator pitch, right? But it needs to go a step further. Like, your story has to be compelling, and it has to be something that no one else is doing, right? What makes you unique? What makes you stand out? But it's not just now. The more you can strategize further down the road to see where you're going to be 5 years and 10 years from now, the less duplication of efforts, the less correction of errors, all of those things you can avoid. All those inflection point problem areas if you know what your path is going to look like going forward. And especially going into preclinical work, as I'm sure the scientists on the call can attest, there are a bevy of, new research topics that come up all the time, new potential areas of treatment for multiple indications. And so sometimes you got to keep your, head straight that you're creating a pipeline and a successful portfolio, as opposed to, well, that's the newest and latest, or that sounds interesting. Does it really strengthen your story?
Yeah, and I would say the biggest challenges that I've seen in that period are more like, I don't know what I don't know, right? Because and I think Kim, you talked about or alluded to this earlier, is a lot of the people that are in the company at this phase, you generally don't have a CFO at this point. You generally don't have even a controller at this point. And so, you don't know what you don't know. So, systems are kind of ad hoc. A lot of things are done in Excel. The business side of it is not as complex as when you get later into financials, but it doesn't mean that it should be completely overlooked. So, having at least that, being able to ask that question and really just, searching out advice on, what does my life cycle look like and what do I need to be concerned when? Getting that advice a little earlier and at least knowing when you should be asking the questions is good. And we've seen a lot of people that later on down have wished, and we'll talk about this later, that they had started doing some of the preparatory stuff even in preclinical phase.
Absolutely, James. Just because you're a startup company doesn't mean you can't have all the specialties you need to run the business fully, but you don't have to bring them all in-house. You can have folks who specialize in systems but are outsourced. You can have folks who specialize in finance and accounting but are outsourced, because you don't want to waste all your capital right away on becoming a 100-person company overnight, right? You're gonna take your time and grow with your needs. But you can always supplement that with outside help.
Great. So what considerations are often overlooked before moving to phase 1 in clinical trials?
I think, after the initial excitement of the IND has been approved and we're going into the clinic, there's a flurry of activity that happens where folks are just so excited to get in the clinic and get patients enrolled and start making a difference. So there's just administrative things that we need to make sure are being done correctly from the start. First thing that's really important, I think, is finding the right CRO or clinical research organization, and not only having them work with the clinical folks in your organization, but with your finance and accounting people as well. There's a lot of critical information that they provide, whether it's for your budget or whether it is for your closing your books or for your audit. Your CROs are critical. And so you want to understand not only the nature of the contracts that you have with them from a financial perspective, but how they're going ultimately to provide you with key metrics. How are they going to be held accountable, and how are you going to reflect that in your books?
Yeah, and cash is king. And if they're not getting you that information, or it's not required for them to get you that information in a timely fashion to know what they've spent and what pass-through expenses are there and what milestones they're hitting, it's really going to leave you in a little bit of a black hole as to what's going on.
So what options are currently present to phase 1 companies that alleviate some of these issues?
I think there's two major categories. There's resources and systems. So from a resource perspective, again, you can outsource any specialty, any expertise that you might need. It doesn't require a full-time employee yet. You might be at a stage that even at phase 1, where the volume of work doesn't justify a full finance and accounting department, but it doesn't mean that there aren't basic accounting operations that shouldn't be happening every day, every month at a minimum. So there's, how do I resource this department? Is it a temp? Is it a consultant? Is it a service firm? Or when are we going to be ready to move to bringing someone in-house to own the books from soup to nuts? And then the second one is for systems. There's some really good systems out there that private organizations that, preclinical, phase 1, even phase 2, that are perfectly adequate. QuickBooks, people hear QuickBooks and think, oh no, that's for, small mom and pop businesses. It's really not. I mean, there are companies that go public on QuickBooks. And there's another software called Xero. These are things, typical general ledger systems we see in early stage companies that are usually supplemented by things like Bill.com or other type of payment processing systems. And then as well, your payroll. James, you want to probably
Yeah.
have something good to add there on systems.
Yeah, and this is the time where I, kind of make the general statement. When we say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and some people might be listening, we're talking kind of like the general, right? That kind of bell curve. I've seen phase 1 companies that have 300 people in them, where their lead candidate is phase 1. So, not every company's created the same, but generally, if you're in phase 1, your clinical trials are less complicated. You have less need for accounting staff. Your personnel's smaller. You're 10 to 15 people or what have you. But of course, there's outliers, right? But yeah, you're right, Kim. I mean, at that point, if you're that 15-person company, that the vast majority of people are dealing with the phase 1 clinical trial, or maybe even some lab people. It's not that complicated at that point. You can get away with QuickBooks, and I always say it's a as soon as possible, but as late as practical. And what I mean by that is don't put something in that's super complex too early, because it's going to weigh you down. But don't wait until you need it to put something in that's more sophisticated. So for instance, QuickBooks, like Kim says, there's more than a few public companies that we've implemented for that have been on QuickBooks before the implementation. So, it's not necessarily a thing of, are you public, are you what have you, it's really the complexity. But, like with a supplement of people, with systems, using something like a Bill.com or Procurify or Prendio or all these different tools, Expensify, that help you, help you capture costs, help you capture data without spending a lot of people time on things. So, there's definitely some ability to, use some outsourced vendors instead of hiring, full-time people. And there's also the ability of using some of the systems that are out there that may not be the systems that you're going to use forever, but they're good enough to get you through to that next stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, QuickBooks, if you're heavy in inventory early on, QuickBooks isn't going to work for you. But if you have pretty low volume again, or just not a lot of very technical accounting, QuickBooks is perfectly adequate.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to phase 2 companies. So after a good data readout, you look to begin phase 2. What is the next important consideration a company needs to make?
As you're waiting for that data to start coming in on your phase 1 trial, you're probably starting to think about, how am I going to fund phase 2? So there's a lot happening in the finance and accounting group, because we need to justify what that funding looks like. How much do we need? How long is it going to last us? So there's work going on, budgets and forecasts and all kinds of fun analysis that have to happen to figure out, what does that look like? And beyond just the dollars, to keep the lights on, you have to think about the infrastructure of the company itself. Do I have the right bodies in place for all the various functions? Do I have the right systems in place? And how can I get them and keep everything running smoothly? This is also a big time when people start thinking about going public. If they're anticipating good data readout at phase 2, before they go into phase 2, they might be ready to pull that trigger and switch over to the public markets. And so at that point, a lot of focus is going to turn towards the financials and getting an auditor in place and making sure your books are up to snuff. Something I would recommend doing sooner rather than later, even if you're not considering an IPO, is just to have your books being closed frequently on, best practices a monthly basis, so that you always have timely and accurate financials to provide to stakeholders. But certainly in an IPO standpoint, you're bringing in a third party firm like an auditor to take a look and to clean up your books.
Yeah, and to that point, somewhere in this range, and in some cases, you don't even make it to phase 3, meaning like if it's a fast track or some type of different type of product, you're like Kim's saying, you go to IPO, or there's a couple of different reasons why you start looking at more sophistication, right? You're either going to IPO, and so you're going to become public, and you need to be more auditable. You are going global, so you're starting to have clinical trials that are global in nature. So, your phase 2, and then eventually your phase 2-3 clinical trials may be global in nature. So therefore, you're dealing with multi-currency issues. You're dealing with vendors that are being paid in different currencies potentially. And then also just the sheer volumes of transactions. So a phase 2 clinical trial is more complicated than a phase 1 by nature. And the people that you're dealing with, you're paying more people, and you have more people that are hired. So, you're starting to build out that infrastructure. Again, what we always recommend is that you seek out advice earlier in the process to know what you don't know, to look for those black holes and to kind of prep your life cycle. There are people that have been through this before and know what you're going to hit, as you move through this.
Right. And you don't have to be ready to go from 0 to 100, on day one. Again, these other folks, these subject matter experts are a bridge that you can walk across until you're ready to flesh it all out yourself. Because one other risk that I have seen is in that push to get to phase 2, maybe overhiring, and you've brought in a lot of people to help. And then if perhaps the data doesn't go the way you would intended, you might have to worry about a potential restructuring.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep. And one thing to think about from the financial and accounting standpoint too is if you're getting ready and you're thinking seriously about that public status, you're going to need to develop some additional procedures and processes, policies that folks may balk at if they're not, familiar with a public company environment. But things like Sarbanes-Oxley, again, SEC reporting, things that you may not have in-house yet.
That's a really good point, because one of the things that I see in a lot of these companies is, we'll see them when they're at this stage, right? They're either late phase 2 or early phase 3. Again, I'm talking about the general, right? But there's always the outliers. When that complexity really starts to ramp up, and some of the things you can start thinking about before you get to that point is, like you said, your monthly close, the delegation of authority or authority matrix, getting that locked down, making sure that purchases are going through approval processes, getting your accounting in order, having someone outside or starting to look internal for someone who's going to code things in a way that'll take you through that next stage of life cycle.
Agreed. And it's important too that when you do go public, there is a little bit of a grace period from around Sarbanes-Oxley, depending on if you, for example, filed under as emerging company under the Jobs Act, you would have a little bit of a grace period before you needed to be Sarbanes-Oxley compliant. So you have time to put the right controls in place, not for the sake of the control, but for the sake of what it's trying to achieve, which is to prevent material misstatement.
Definitely.
All right, so what are the common growing pains experienced when moving forward to phase 3 from phase 2?
Yeah, so So when you're going towards phase 3, and this really is for most companies, when you start a phase 3 clinical trial, you're on that last leg, and depending on the product, depending on the company, this might be a couple of years, it might be a year, it might be whatever that time frame is. You're really starting to think about a lot of things that are going to hit the financial side. um, and you're starting to think about systems that are more connected, right? So we talked about earlier, when it's a younger company, when it's a little less complex, you can use these kind of standalone systems like a Bill.com, like an Expensify. I can throw out all kinds of different names, but they're little, inexpensive, easy to implement, easy to use applications that make life easier for somebody. But eventually you're going to get to the point now where you have a growing group of people, 60, 80 people. And so you're going to have to control their spend. You're going to have to control, more of and coordinate more of the purchasing, coordinate more of the vendor payments, coordinate even inventory, as you go closer to supply chain. So thinking about that, and again, getting the advice early doesn't mean you have to implement anything right away, but at least knowing when you should start talking about these things. The earlier you can get that advice and say, okay, well, we are planning to be commercial Q3 of 2004, or I'm sorry, 2024, or, something along those lines. It may be way far out there. But someone a mentor within this market can tell you, when you should start thinking about different pieces of those systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So moving to phase 3, and to kind of start to wrap up, what is the biggest challenge unique to phase 3 that a company should anticipate for, and what challenges from previous phases arise again?
Yeah. So again, I gotta keep on throwing back. This is phase 3, but it may change depending on your product. But really at this point, you're counting off of when you're going to commercialize. So there's a complexity now that you have to start thinking about supply chain, and so you're going to be marking back from commercialization to say, okay, if I'm a year or two out from commercialization, then I want to start thinking about getting my supply chain in the system maybe 6 months to a year from now to make sure that I've got it all locked down before I go commercial. And then I'm ready to start dealing with the 3PL or whoever I've engaged to move that product. I really need to kind of think that out and lay that out to make sure that my systems are mapping, to where my life's, to where my company's moving. One of the worst things that can happen is, that you wait too long, right? Because then you're implementing, you're putting these more enterprise systems in either during commercialization, which is really, really bad, or after commercialization, which means that essentially, you've gone through commercialization using systems that are not quite appropriate, or maybe not fit for purpose, which is really going to be a struggle and a stress on the organization as a whole.
I totally agree. 2 ounces of prevention is an ounce of cure, right? Or is that the saying? That anything you can do up front, even just to think about it, you might not have to do anything, just have a conversation about what system you might need at what point in your growth. The best results will follow. There's been this move in the industry towards, especially in cell and gene therapy specifically, where a lot of companies are focused on a vertically integrated organization, manufacturing your own CGMP qualified product. If you're talking about how am I going to build and create physical assets for the company, you need to be talking about that sooner in order to go commercial at phase 3. You need to have that manufacturing capacity in place. What vendors are you going to work with? If you're not going to manufacture yourself, where are you going to get all your supplies so there's no interruption in your production process? These are not short-term projects, and you're going to have the FDA itself come in and qualify your facility if you want to be CGMP. So the sooner the better.
Yeah, when we talk about GMP facilities, our recommendation and what we tell our prospects and we work with our clients on is really getting systems in place even before you do the water runs of the system, way before you're doing GMP runs. If you think about it, the when you get to the point of actually doing a GMP run, even for clinical trial supply, you have to have all of your systems in place. You have to have, all of your validation documentation in place. You have to have all your processes documented through SOPs, so on and so forth. Well, if you do it manually, which a lot of people will do, a lot of companies will do their first, step out of the gate, they're investing tens of millions of dollars to bring a facility online, but then they're manually doing all of the validation and all of the acceptance of goods into the system and the movement of quarantine goods into release status and so on and so forth. And when they then get a little later on down the line, they put a system in place to handle that. There are companies out there, AdaptaLogix being one of them, that actually have the best practices in place to actually put those in place when you're doing your water runs, so you don't have to come up with those SOPs for the for your manual processes, or the Excel spreadsheets that are tracking inventory, all those things that you're eventually going to have to replace. And it just makes life a lot easier when you then move into that GMP run, you move towards commercialization, just getting all those pieces in place.
Yeah, when it sounds like from what you're describing, James, you really need to have IT involved in parallel with everything that your GMP, your manufacturing group is doing. And to take it another step further, finance as well. I will beat this drum a lot, that everything an organization does will affect the financials of the company. So it's important to keep finance and accounting in those communications, in those discussions. But critically, for getting that FDA qualification, you need a CFR 11 compliant system, financial system, if it touches that manufacturing environment. And this is stuff, IT will definitely have their hands around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to think about with that. And, again, it's the, as soon as possible, as early as as late as practical. If you have to go to create GMP batches without a system in place, you're creating a whole nother system that's going to have to be replaced eventually. So, getting these things lined up, having your, IT person or provider or whatever involved, having your finance person involved, and really kind of going down the path of, okay, what do we need to get this so we can scale operations, as in literally produce the product, but then also make sure that we're capturing all the data for Sarbanes-Oxley as well as the FDA. So at the end of the day, we aren't wasting time. We've got a clear picture on what we're doing, and we don't end up sideways in either of those areas.
Great. So when you get a final data readout in phase 3, and for some biotech companies, this happens back in phase 2, as well as those cell and gene therapy companies, any fast track or breakthrough technologies, you go to file for the NDA. What needs to be solidified in your process and or system that would help you become a successful commercial pharmaceutical company?
Yeah, so the big thing is you're going to start to look at how you are going to sell the product, which generally involves a 3PL, and whatever commercial agreements. So one of the things that, and again, we're looking at this through the financial lens. One of the things that I tell my customers is you really want to be looking at this at least 6 to 9 months before commercialization, because you're going to be engaging with that 3PL, before your commercial, of course, right? I mean, you got to get the products out to sell it. a big part of that 3PL contract and how they operate and do business is getting you data back on what they're selling, what they're moving, what the potential expiry, destruction is, all kinds of different stuff, returns, depending on what they're doing for you. They could be doing the cash receipts as well as AR. So getting the financial side of the house involved in the 3PL discussion is super important. Then also understanding how you're going to get that data into your financial system. Is it going to be hand entered every month? Is it going to be an automatic feed because because you have so many SKUs and so many transactions that it's just not worth it to have a couple people sitting down there hand entering them all the time. Those discussions are pretty easy to have. The earlier you have those, the better, because then you can start to make your plan. You can start to really get in front of that and make sure that, that data is included in your contract with that 3PL.
And one thing I would add to what you just said, James, is considerations for the Sunshine Act. Being able to report healthcare provider payments if you're going to be an insurance covered product. So you're going to have something in your general ledger system, your accounts payable system, or your expense management system that allows you to be compliant with those reporting requirements.
Yeah, and something you mentioned in there, I just want to make sure I highlight it is, the vast majority of these Sunshine Acts are going to go through your expense reporting system, but don't forget the AP system. So it's a small number of transactions, but usually big dollars, and something that put a couple of key pieces of information in there. It makes your life a lot easier when you go to report.
Absolutely.
Great. So everyone, this is the end of our formal questions. Do you guys have any final thoughts or anything that we missed or anything that you would like to add?
I mean, yeah, I reiterated throughout the talk today, but I think it's good to reiterate again. Every time I get on a call with, a new prospect or even my customers, they'll call me and say, I feel a little bit silly asking. It might be a little too early to ask this, or, any version of that. And, we'll start talking. And even if it is a little early, talking's cheap. I mean, it really, it's the cheapest form of planning you can do is talk to someone, mentor or someone like a here at AdaptaLogix or in Genova, that has been through this before, that knows these, the pitfalls that you're going to get into, because even a half an hour conversation can tell you exactly when you should start thinking about certain things. Like, okay, well, I'm entering the phase 3. When should I think about, an ERP system? When should I think about, 3PL? When should I think about, these different things from a financial and accounting side? There's a been there, done that. People have done this over and over again. That conversation can really kind of give you that life cycle and that plan that really kind of lets you know if you're too early or too late to get into things, and really give you that information before it is too late.
Yeah, I echo everything James just said. And for me, getting into these startup organizations and seeing where things are and where they could have been, had it been for, a planning session or asking those questions like James mentioned earlier. We've seen, as have others, that there are best practices to follow that will take you from where you are to where you want to go. You're not the first person that's been there. So the answer does exist, and others and their, what they've experienced, and if they happen to be an expert in that particular topic, they're there. You just have to reach out to folks. The life science industry is really great in that there is a community of like-minded folks who are not hoarding information, trying to share everything they've learned to prevent someone else from having to go down, make the same mistakes that they did. And so it's there. I just say, reach out and talk to other folks and ask questions, lots of questions.
So thank you everyone for joining, and a big thanks to Kim and James for taking the time out of their busy schedules to do this. We hope our audience was able to learn and collect some information about the road ahead. And if you have any questions at all, we encourage you to reach out to us here at AdaptaLogix, as well as the Genova group, with any questions you may have, and let us know how you like the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the day.